We often associate intelligence with the ability to navigate modern technology. When a toddler swipes through a tablet or operates a television remote, it looks like an intellectual achievement. But pressing a static button on a rigid layout requires almost no cognitive load. It is a conditioned routine, similar to a laboratory rat pressing a lever to receive a piece of cheese. Because the brain isn't calculating unpredictable spatial variables, it remains largely deactivated. This reliance on low-stimulus conditioning defines much of adult physical life. We log miles on a flat, predictable treadmill, or practice martial arts by memorizing rigid, geometric blocks. These systems turn the human being into a machine operating on a fixed track. They work in a sterile gym with a cooperative partner, but they rely on an assumption of symmetry that rarely exists in the real world. This lack of physical complexity has created a measurable decline in both physical and mental health. Data from the Franklin Institute shows that nearly half of young adults between 12 and 21 do not engage in regular, vigorous activity. This sedentary culture has led to a tripling of childhood obesity since 1980 and a widespread state of neural stagnation that mirrors the stagnant blood circulation of a cramped airplane seat. By substituting true motoric versatility for repetitive conditioning, we have restricted the environmental stimuli the brain needs to maintain its operational network. Everything changes when the environment becomes unpredictable. In a sudden car collision or a high-speed physical ambush, there is no prearranged script. An attacker doesn't follow a geometric formula. They move with explosive, unstructured momentum. Under this level of kinetic stress, the human nervous system frequently suffers a systemic breakdown. Whether you are a trained athlete or a rational thinker, the conscious forebrain bottlenecks. You cannot scan through a catalog of memorized techniques when an attack lands in fractions of a second. You freeze. This crash occurs because we treat the brain as a thinking organ, isolated from movement. In reality, the brain develops through physical complexity. When we restrict our movement to rigid routines, we short-circuit the biological pathways required to navigate chaos. Consider how the brain builds itself. When a child learns to ride a bicycle, the brain works at peak capacity to map conflicting motor requirements. This demand forces the creation of new synapses and wraps the circuits in myelin, an insulating layer that accelerates signal transmission. However, once that movement hardens into a repetitive routine, like riding in a straight line or running on a treadmill, the neuroplastic challenge disappears. The brain architecture is a ruthless economic system. When pathways are no longer challenged by novel tasks, receptors leave the synapses and the connections systematically wither. This process specifically targets the intraparietal sulcus, or IPS. This region handles perceptual motor coordination and visuospatial working memory. Research shows that engaging in complex, uncoordinated tasks, like juggling, causes the IPS to structurally grow. By forcing the body into creative, unpredictable movement, you are reinforcing the exact brain regions required for mathematics and logic. True intelligence is the fluid flexibility of your thinking. To maintain it, your physical choices must demand absolute motoric versatility. Conventional training relies on visual inputs, watching an opponent's shoulders or tracking a fist. But under high-speed stress, the human eye becomes a devastating bottleneck. A visual signal must travel a cumbersome path, from the optic nerve to the visual cortex for processing, then to the forebrain for rational evaluation, before finally transmitting a command down the spinal cord. This multi-step cognitive loop takes too long. An explosive strike lands in 0.1 to 0.2 seconds, easily outrunning the processing speed of the human visual cortex. Mathematically, any defensive framework that requires you to consciously decode an attack is predisposed to fail. If your response requires visual confirmation and intellectual choice, the strike will land before your brain completes its evaluation. When extreme pressure hits, the brain undergoes a biological override. The amygdala detects an existential threat and instantly shuts down the rational forebrain to conserve metabolic energy. Operational control shifts to the brainstem, the oldest, most primitive structure in the brain. This region regulates heart rate and respiration, but it possesses no concept of logic or morality. The brainstem understands only two absolute scripts for survival: absolute flight to exit the danger zone, or an absolute attack to terminate the threat. The freeze happens when we try to impose a hesitant, compromise state, like a defensive block or a cautious step, that has no biological precedent. These middle ground habits create a collision of signals, causing the nervous system to stall because the brainstem has no script for hesitation. To bypass this delay, we must shift the primary sensory trigger from sight to physical touch. Human skin and joints are embedded with mechanoreceptors. The millisecond an attacker makes contact, these receptors register the vector and force of that pressure. These tactile signals travel directly to the spinal cord at up to 120 meters per second. This creates a closed-loop reflex. The attacker's touch becomes the direct trigger for an automated structural response, bypassing the intellectual bottleneck entirely. By utilizing specialized reflex programming, you can turn a predator's mandatory physical contact into the catalyst for their own destruction before your conscious mind even registers the impact. While these reflexes are vital for survival, the rewired nervous system also dictates your performance in everyday environments, from corporate decision-making to handling social stress. This connection is rooted in brain chemistry. The brain uses acetylcholine as its primary neurotransmitter for both muscle communication and cognitive focus. Research shows that physical inactivity quickly disassembles the molecular scaffolds for these receptors. By maintaining myelinated pathways through complex movement, you ensure the stability of the same chemical systems required for emotional stability and mental attention under pressure. The physical bridge for this unified system is the psoas major. It is the strongest flexor of the hip, beginning at the lumbar spine and inserting into the inner thigh bone. Modern sitting habits keep this muscle in a constantly contracted position. Over time, it loses flexibility and hardens, dragging down the shoulders and collapsing the chest. This structural collapse locks the core axis, which restricts the fluid transmission of neural signals and leads to chronic pain. Actively engaging the psoas through unpredictable physical complexity reverses this decay. It forces the nervous system to continue growing and reinforces the structural axis required for unobstructed signal transmission. Human intelligence is not an isolated mental exercise. It is a direct product of movement. To optimize your brain's capacity to adapt and survive, you must restore your natural anatomical order and move yourself smart.